Lightning split the darkening Ohio sky, illuminating a scene that seemed torn from a nightmare. 16-year-old Emma Wilson struggled against the rough ropes binding her wrists to the ancient oak tree, her blonde hair plastered to her face by the first heavy drops of rain. The massive tree stood alone in the field, half a mile from the nearest road, a silent witness to her terror. "Let's see how long it takes for someone to care about you, boy girl." Brad Dawson had smeared his varsity jacket bright red against the gathering storm clouds. His final words echoed in her mind as the headlights of his pickup truck had disappeared around the bend, carrying him and his laughing friends back to town. Emma twisted her wrists against the coarse rope, wincing as it bit deeper into her skin. The thunder rumbled closer now, a harbinger of the storm front that local radio had been warning about all day. The kind that tore roofs from barns and flooded the creek beds. The kind no one should be caught outside in. She craned her neck, feeling the rough bark scrape against her back through the thin cotton of her work shirt. The ancient oak had stood in this field for over 100 years, its sprawling branches now swaying ominously above her as the wind picked up. Once her favorite reading spot, now it had become her prison, and possibly worse if the storm hit before anyone found her. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, trying to remember what he had taught her. "Assess the situation. Use what you have." What she had was a pocket, and in that pocket was a cell phone, a cheap flip phone she'd saved up for by doing extra chores when her parents didn't even know about. One that contained a number she'd memorized but never dialed. Emma twisted her body, ignoring the pain as the rope cut deeper. Her fingers trembling from both fear and the rapidly dropping temperature, fumbled for the phone. It slipped once, twice, but she caught it, her breath hitching as she flipped it open with one hand. The screen glowed faintly, a lifeline in the gathering dark. She dialed the number, her heart racing as it rang once, twice, three times. Then a voice answered, low and steady, cutting through the static like a blade through silk. "Emma, what's wrong?" It was him, the one person who had promised to always be there. "Jack," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They tied me to the oak tree. The storm's coming. I can't get free." There was a brief silence, then his tone shifted, a steel edge replacing the warmth. "Where exactly? Giving me landmarks distance from the farm." "The old oak in the east field, half a mile from the house near Miller's Creek." "Stay calm. I'm coming." His voice was rock steady, but she could hear barked orders in the background, the sound of movement. "Don't hang up. Keep the line open." The rain began to fall harder as Emma clutched the phone, her lifeline to a man who had once promised to protect her, a man who was now thousands of miles away. The Wilson family farm, known locally as Maple Ridge, sat on 80 acres of prime Ohio farmland that had been in the family for 4 generations. From the air, it resembled a patchwork quilt. Squares of cornfields beside strips of soybeans, the weathered red barn and white farmhouse nestled between them like a centerpiece. Inside that farmhouse, Emma Wilson had grown up learning the rhythms of farm life. Each morning began before dawn, her father's gentle knock on her door at 5:00 a.m., as reliable as the rooster's crow. By 5:30, she would be in the barn helping with the morning milking of their small dairy herd, 12 Holstein cows that provided just enough income to supplement the crops. The Wilsons weren't wealthy by any modern standard, but Emma had never wanted for the essentials. Her bedroom was small but cozy, with faded floral wallpaper her mother had hung before she was born, and bookshelves her father had built from oak, harvested on their own land. The window overlooked the eastern field, and on clear mornings the sunrise painted the old oak tree in gold. "A Wilson always takes care of the land, and the land takes care of a Wilson," her father would say, his calloused hands gently showing her how to test soil or repair fencing. Robert Wilson was a man of few words but deep conviction, his face weathered by decades of sun and wind, his back slightly stooped from years of physical labor. Sarah Wilson, Emma's mother, balanced the farm's books with the same precision she used when canning summer vegetables for the winter months. A former school teacher, she had instilled in Emma a love of learning that transcended their rural isolation. Their living room bookshelf held classics alongside agricultural manuals, and dinner conversations often ranged from crop rotation strategies to Shakespeare's sonnets. Emma had inherited her father's quiet determination and her mother's sharp mind. By 16, she could drive the family's 1986 Ford tractor as skillfully as her father repair a fence post without supervision, and had read more books than anyone else in her class at Oakfield High. But Maple Ridge, like many family farms in the region, was struggling. The massive International Harvester combine that had been the pride of the farm in the 1980s now frequently broke down, parts becoming increasingly difficult to find. The tractor needed a new transmission they couldn't afford. Last winter's heating bills had forced them to dip into the emergency fund, and this summer's drought had reduced their corn yield by nearly 30%. What the Wilsons didn't discuss, at least not when Emma was in earshot, were the certified letters from Agricorp that had been arriving with increasing frequency. The massive agricultural conglomerate had been buying up family farms throughout the county, converting them to industrial-scale operations with minimal human oversight. Their headquarters, a gleaming glass structure on the outskirts of Oakfield, seemed to mock the weathered barns and farmhouses that had stood for generations. The day before Emma found herself tied to the oak tree, she had overheard her parents talking in hushed tones at the kitchen table, her father's voice tight with worry. "They've offered 20% less than market value, Sarah. It's highway robbery. But if we can't make the property tax payment next quarter, I'll find a way. A Wilson has worked this land since my grandfather's time. I won't be the one to lose it." Emma had slipped away before they noticed her, the weight of adult concerns settling uncomfortably on her young shoulders. She understood more than they realized. The new development on the north side of town, with its identical houses and manicured lawns, was built on what had once been the Johnson farm. The massive grain silos that had replaced the Peterson place now bore the Agricorp logo. One by one, the families she had grown up with were disappearing, moving to cities or taking jobs at the very company that had displaced them. That night, sitting at her bedroom window and looking out at the oak tree silhouetted against the stars, Emma had made a silent promise to herself. She would find a way to save Maple Ridge. She just didn't know how yet. The next morning, her father had driven into town for supplies, and her mother had asked Emma to collect eggs and clean the chicken coop before school. The tasks were familiar, almost meditative. In the chicken coop, with its comforting smell of feed and straw, Emma felt a momentary peace. She gently placed the brown eggs in her basket, thinking about her upcoming history presentation. The subject was local heritage, and Emma had chosen to focus on the agricultural history of Oakfield County. She had spent weeks interviewing older farmers, including Mr. Henderson, who owned the town's general store, and still remembered when horses, not tractors, plowed the fields. Her research had revealed something interesting, a pattern of land consolidation that had occurred once before during the Great Depression, and how the community had rallied to protect family farms. There were lessons there, she was sure of it. Perhaps history could provide a solution to their current troubles. With these thoughts occupying her mind, Emma hadn't noticed the gathering storm clouds as she walked the mile-long route to Oakfield High School, her presentation notes tucked safely in her backpack. She had no way of knowing that by sunset she would be fighting for her life against both human cruelty and the unforgiving forces of nature. Oakfield, Ohio, population 5,273, was a town caught between two centuries. Main Street still looked much as it had in the 1950s, a row of brick buildings housing Henderson's general store on 1952, Betty's Diner with its chrome-trimmed booths, the single-screen Oakfield Cinema, and the First National Bank, with its imposing Grecian columns. Betty's Diner served as the unofficial town hall, particularly during the morning coffee rush, when farmers and retirees gathered to discuss everything from weather forecasts to local politics. The corner booth was unofficially reserved for the veterans table, where men who had served in conflicts from Vietnam to Desert Storm shared stories and camaraderie over endless cups of coffee. "Morning, Betty," called Frank Henderson as he entered the bell above the door announcing his arrival. At 72, Frank still opened his general store 6 days a week, just as his father had before him. The usual Frank, Betty Harper had owned the diner for nearly 30 years, her once blonde hair now steel gray, but her smile unchanged. "Please, any word on that storm front coming in?" "Jim says it's going to be a bad one," she replied, referring to her husband, a former Air Force meteorologist. "Schools might let out early." The door chimed again and the conversation paused briefly as Richard Dawson entered. Unlike the other morning regulars in their worn flannel and work boots, Dawson wore a tailored suit and carried a leather briefcase emblazoned with the Agricorp logo. As both town council president and regional director for Agricorp, Dawson straddled the worlds of local government and corporate agriculture in ways that many townspeople found increasingly problematic. "Morning, gentlemen," he said with a practiced politician's smile that never quite reached his eyes. At 55, Dawson maintained the ramrod straight posture from his Army days, his salt and pepper hair cut in the same military style he'd worn for decades. The veterans' table responded with nods and muted greetings. Once Dawson had been one of them, a Desert Storm veteran who had returned to his hometown with ambition and connections. But as AgriCorp's presence in the county had grown, so had the distance between Dawson and the community that had raised him. "Big game tonight, eh?" Dawson continued, undeterred by the cool reception. "Brad's been working hard. Scout from Ohio State's coming to watch him play." Brad Dawson Richards' only son was Oakfield High's star quarterback and the town's golden boy. His athletic prowess had brought 3 consecutive regional championships to the school, and with them, a sense of pride that transcended the town's economic struggles. "Weather might have something to say about that game," observed Tom Miller, a Vietnam veteran, whose own farm bordered the Wilsons' property. Dawson waved away the concern. "They've been predicting this storm for days. It'll probably blow over like the last one." As if in response, thunder rumbled in the distance. Across town, Oakfield High School stood as a testament to the community's changing fortunes. The original building, a sturdy brick structure built in 1924, now connected to a modern glass and steel addition, funded primarily by a generous donation from AgriCorp. The contrast between old and new was jarring, much like the social divide among the students who walked its halls. Inside that divide was on full display in Mrs. Henderson's American history class. On one side sat the town kids, many from the new development, where AgriCorp executives and professionals lived. Their clothes bore designer labels, their backpacks were news each year, and their conversations revolved around college visits and summer internships. On the other side sat the farm kids, whose work boots sometimes tracked in mud from morning chores, whose clothes were practical rather than fashionable, and whose future plans were often constrained by family obligations and financial limitations. Emma Wilson sat near the back, her worn notebook open as Mrs. Henderson discussed the upcoming presentations. Despite her academic achievements, she was at the top of her class. Emma preferred to avoid attention. Years of subtle and not-so-subtle teasing about her secondhand clothes and farm girl mannerisms had taught her that invisibility was often the best defense. "For tomorrow's presentations, we'll start with Brad, then Megan, then Emma," Mrs. Henderson announced, consulting her list. Brad Dawson slouched in his seat by the window, his attention focused on his smartphone, hidden beneath his desk. At 18, Brad was the embodiment of small-town success, handsome, athletic, and socially dominant. His red varsity jacket set him apart in the hallways, a symbol of status that many envied and few achieved. "Mr. Dawson," Mrs. Henderson called sharply, "since you seem so engrossed in whatever is on your phone, perhaps you'd like to share your presentation topic with the class." Brad looked up, his practiced smile sliding into place. "Local heroes, Mrs. H, focusing on the football program's contribution to Oakfield's identity." A topic Emma noted that would involve minimal research and maximum self-promotion, given that Brad himself was currently the program's star. She returned her attention to her own notes, unaware that she had caught Brad's eye, not with admiration, but with something far darker. After class, Emma hurried to her locker, hoping to avoid the between-class crush in the hallways. She was reaching for her science textbook when a shadow fell across her. "Farm girl," Brad's voice held a casual cruelty that made her shoulders tense. "Heard you're doing your presentation on dirt or tractors or whatever." Emma didn't turn around. "Agricultural history," she corrected quietly, wishing he would move on. "Fascinating," he drawled, leaning against the adjacent locker. His friends Megan Foster and Dylan Cooper hovered nearby, Megan watching with a smirk, Dylan looking uncomfortable but silent. "You should include how places like your family's sad little farm are being replaced by actual modern agriculture. Progress, you know." The hallway seemed to contract, other students slowing to watch the interaction. Emma felt heat rising in her cheeks, but kept her expression neutral as she finally faced him. "I'll be sure to address the economic and environmental impacts of industrial farming versus sustainable family operations," she said evenly. "The research is actually quite clear on the long-term disadvantages of—" "Nobody cares about your research." Brad cut her off, his smile hardening. "Just like nobody's going to care when your family finally gives up and sells to AgriCorp. It's happening, farm girl. Places like yours are history, which I guess makes your presentation appropriate." As he walked away, laughter trailing in his wake, Emma stood frozen, her fingers tight around her textbook. What Brad didn't know, what no one at school knew, was that his casual cruelty had struck directly at her deepest fear, and that fear would soon push her into using the emergency number she had carried for years, setting in motion events that would change Oakfield forever. What no one in the school hallway could have guessed was that the most significant detail about Emma Wilson wasn't visible at all. It wasn't her secondhand clothes or her academic achievements. It was the dog tags she wore beneath her shirt, pressed against her skin like a secret promise, and the memory of the man who had given them to her. A man who had taught her that true strength often came disguised as gentleness, and that promises made were sacred bonds. The storm clouds gathering over Oakfield that afternoon weren't just meteorological. They were the visible manifestation of tensions that had been building for years. Between tradition and progress, between corporate power and individual dignity, between those who saw the land as a resource to exploit and those who saw it as a heritage to protect. And in the center of that storm, though, she didn't yet realize it, stood Emma Wilson. Inside the school, an announcement crackled over the intercom. Due to the severe weather warning, all after-school activities, including tonight's football game, are canceled. Students who walk home are advised to make alternative arrangements or report to the gymnasium to wait until the weather clears. The hallways erupted in groans and excited chatter. A canceled game was unprecedented, especially one with college scouts attending. In the crowded corridor, Emma overheard Brad's angry voice. "This is bullshit. One little storm and they cancel the biggest game of the season." "Your dad's on the school board," Megan suggested. "Can't he do something?" "He's trying, but the principal's being a pussy about liability." Brad slammed his locker shut. "Coach says the scout might reschedule, but there's no guarantee." Emma slipped past them, head down, making her way toward the library. With school letting out early and her parents unaware of the change, she planned to wait out the storm there, working on her presentation. The library was her sanctuary, one of the few places at Oakfield High where social status mattered less than the content of one's mind. She settled at a corner table, spreading out her research materials, interviews she had conducted with elderly farmers, historical newspaper clippings from the county archive, and data she had compiled comparing farm ownership over the decades. Her presentation wasn't just academic, it was personal. Through it, she hoped to articulate what was being lost as family farms disappeared. Emma was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice Brad, Megan, and Dylan enter the library until they were standing at her table. "Working hard, farm girl." Brad's voice held an edge that immediately put her on alert. "Just finishing my presentation," Emma replied neutrally, beginning to gather her papers. "Let me see," Brad said, snatching one of her handwritten pages before she could stop him. His eyes narrowed as he scanned it. The decline of family farming represents not just an economic shift, but a cultural loss that threatens the foundation of rural American identity. He looked up, his expression darkening. "Are you seriously trashing my dad's company in your presentation?" "It's not about your dad," Emma said, reaching for the paper. "It's historical analysis based on what your family's failure to keep up with the times." Brad crumpled the paper in his fist. "My father built something that actually matters. What has yours done except cling to a dying way of life?" Emma felt a surge of anger, hot and unfamiliar. "My family has worked the same land for 4 generations. We've fed this community, preserved the soil, and respected the balance of nature. That matters." The librarian, Mrs. Patel, looked up from her desk, sensing the tension. Brad leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You think you're so smart, don't you? But smart doesn't matter in the real world. Power does, and your kind, you have none." "Everything all right over there?" Mrs. Patel called. "Just fine," Brad replied with a smile, straightening up. "Emma was just sharing her presentation with us. Very educational." As they walked away, Emma heard Dylan whisper, "Come on, man, leave her alone. She's not worth the trouble." "Not your call," Brad replied, just loud enough for Emma to hear. "Farm girl needs to learn her place." The encounter left Emma shaken not just by Brad's hostility, but by the realization that her presentation had struck a nerve. She had intended to make an academic point about agricultural history and economics. Instead, she had inadvertently challenged the narrative that justified agricorps and by extension, Richard Dawson's, growing control over the community. By 3:30 p.m., the library was closing early due to the storm. Through the windows, Emma could see that the sky had darkened considerably, occasional lightning flashes illuminating the school parking lot where only a few cars remained. "Do you need a ride home, dear?" Mrs. Patel asked as Emma packed her backpack. "Thank you, but I'll be fine," Emma replied. "It's not far." It wasn't entirely true. The walk home was just over a mile, and with the storm approaching, it would be a wet journey. But Emma was used to walking in all weather, and she didn't want to impose. As she pushed open the heavy front doors of the school, the wind nearly took her breath away. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees since morning, and the air smelled of rain and electricity. Emma pulled her lightweight jacket tighter and began walking quickly, calculating whether she could make it home before the worst of the storm hit. She had just passed the town limits, the houses giving way to open fields, when she heard the rumble of an engine behind her. A red pickup truck slowed alongside her, Brad Dawson at the wheel. "Need a ride, farm girl?" he called through the open window, his tone deceptively friendly. "Storm's coming in fast." Emma shook her head. "No thanks, I'm almost home." It wasn't true, she was still at least half a mile from Maple Ridge, but something in Brad's smile made her uneasy. "Don't be stupid," he insisted. "Get in." "I'm fine walking." The truck pulled ahead and stopped blocking her path. Brad stepped out, followed by Megan and Dylan from the passenger side. "You embarrassed me in the library," Brad said, all pretense of friendliness gone. "Nobody does that." Emma took a step back, suddenly very aware of how isolated they were on the country road. "I didn't mean to embarrass anyone. I'm just doing my assignment." "An assignment that makes my father look like the bad guy." Brad advanced toward her. "You know what I think? I think you need a lesson in respect." "Brad, come on," Dylan interjected. "This is getting out of hand. Let's just go." "Shut up," Brad snapped, not taking his eyes off Emma. "Farm girl thinks she's better than us with her straight A's and her moral high ground about family farms. But out here, grades don't matter." Emma calculated her options. Running back toward town would take too long. Running across the open field would leave her exposed. The only advantage she had was her knowledge of the terrain. "If you touch me," she said with more confidence than she felt, "I'll report you." Brad laughed. "To who?" "My father runs this town. Principal Morris won't risk losing AgriCorp's funding over some farm girl's word against mine." Lightning flashed overhead, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The storm was nearly upon them. "Last chance to apologize and get in the truck." Brad offered, rain beginning to spatter on the pavement between them. Emma stood her ground, remembering words spoken to her years ago. "Never show fear to a bully. They feed on it." "I have nothing to apologize for," she said quietly. What happened next was a blur of motion and fear. Brad lunged forward, grabbing her arm. Emma twisted away, breaking his grip as she'd been taught, but Megan was behind her, shoving her toward the truck. Dylan stood by, his expression conflicted, but his body blocking any escape route. "Let me go," Emma shouted, her voice nearly lost in another roll of thunder. "Take her to the oak tree," Brad commanded. His face twisted with anger as he grabbed her backpack, sending her papers flying into the wind and rain. They forced her into the truck bed, Brad's grip bruising her arms as Dylan reluctantly helped restrain her. The pickup lurched forward, turning onto a dirt access road that cut through the fields. A shortcut Emma herself often used now turned against her. Through the rain, she could see their destination taking shape, the ancient oak tree that stood alone in the eastern field, her favorite reading spot in better weather. The truck skidded to a halt in the muddy soil beneath its sprawling branches. "Get her out," Brad ordered, jumping down from the WAM and opening a toolbox mounted behind the cab. He withdrew a coil of rope, the kind used for securing hay bales. "This is insane," Dylan protested weakly. "We can't just leave her out here." "We're teaching her a lesson," Brad replied, testing the rope's strength between his hands. "She'll be fine. Someone will find her eventually." "The storm," Dylan began. "We'll give her time to think about respect." Brad cut him off. "Now help me or you can join her." They dragged Emma to the oak tree, her resistance hampered by the slippery ground and their superior strength. Despite her efforts to fight back, a knee to Brad's thigh, an elbow to Megan's ribs, they managed to force her back against the massive trunk. "Hold her," Brad commanded, and Dylan reluctantly complied, avoiding Emma's eyes as he pinned her arms while Brad wrapped the rope around her and the tree binding her wrists behind the trunk. "You won't get away with this," Emma gasped, rain streaming down her face mingling with tears of rage she refused to acknowledge. Brad leaned in close, his voice cold. "I already have. By the time anyone finds you, you'll have learned your place in this town." "People will look for me," she insisted. "Your parents think you're at school because of the storm. The school thinks you're safely home. No one will miss you until morning." He straightened up, admiring his handiwork. "Maybe by then you'll be ready to apologize for disrespecting my family." As they turned to leave, Dylan hesitated, looking back at Emma with what might have been regret. Furtively, he placed something on the ground several feet away. A pocket knife, she realized, but positioned just out of her reach. "Let's go," Brad called, already climbing into the truck. The red taillights of the pickup disappeared into the intensifying rain, leaving Emma alone with the rising wind and her own racing thoughts. The rope was tight, the knot secure. The knife Dylan had left was a useless gesture too far away to reach. Lightning split the sky directly overhead, illuminating the field in stark white light. The rain had soaked through her clothes, and as the temperature continued to drop, she began to shiver uncontrollably. "Think," she whispered to herself. "What would Jack do?" And in that moment of desperation, Emma remembered the phone in her pocket and the number she had never dialed but always carried. The summer of '91 had changed Emma Wilson's life, though she'd been too young to fully understand it at the time. At 8 years old, her world had been limited to Maple Ridge Farm, Oakfield Elementary School, and the occasional trip into Columbus for special occasions. That June, her father had received a phone call that brought a stranger to their dinner table, a young Army captain recovering from wounds sustained in Operation Desert Storm. Jack Reeves was the son of Robert Wilson's old Army buddy in need of a quiet place to heal both body and mind before returning to duty. Emma's first impression of Captain Reeves had been one of cautious fascination. At 27, he had seemed impossibly grown up to her, 8-year-old eyes, his military bearing, softened by pain he tried to hide. A shrapnel wound had left him with a limp that the doctors assured him would improve with time and physical therapy. The invisible wounds, the ones that made him startle at sudden noises and wake shouting in the night, would take longer to heal. "Why does he jump when the screen door slams?" Emma had asked her mother after Jack's first week at the farm. Sarah Wilson had considered her daughter thoughtfully before answering. "Captain Reeves has been in places where loud noises meant danger. His body remembers even when his mind knows he's safe now." Emma had nodded, absorbing this information with a child's simplicity. The next day, she had carefully oiled the hinges of the screen door so it wouldn't slam. Jack had noticed, though, he didn't comment on it directly. Instead, he'd started spending more time with Emma first, just sitting quietly on the porch while she read her books, then gradually engaging her in conversation. "What are you reading?" he'd asked one afternoon, easing himself onto the porch swing beside her. "Little House on the Prairie," Emma had replied, showing him the cover. "It's about a girl who lives on a farm a long time ago." Jack had smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes, a rarity in those early weeks. "I read those books when I was young. My grandmother had the whole series." That shared interest had opened a door between them. Soon Jack was joining Emma for her morning chores, teaching her how to more efficiently collect eggs and feed the chickens. In return, she showed him her secret reading spot beneath the old oak tree where the sprawling branches created a natural canopy. "This is a good tactical position," he'd observed, scanning the surrounding fields with an automatic vigilance that never quite left him. "You can see anyone approaching from all directions." "What's tactical mean?" Emma had asked, sounding out the unfamiliar word. Jack had settled against the trunk, stretching out his injured leg. "It means it's a smart place to be if you need to watch for visitors." He'd modified his explanation for her young ears, but the soldier in him approved of her instinctive choice of location. As weeks passed, Jack's physical strength returned. He began helping Robert with farm tasks, his military precision bringing a new efficiency to their operations. He repaired machinery with tools he fashioned himself, installed an irrigation system that saved hours of manual watering, and reinforced the barn roof before harvest season. For Emma, however, the most significant changes were the lessons Jack shared. Unlike school learning with its focus on facts and figures, Jack taught principles, ways of thinking and being that seemed to come from a deeper well of wisdom than his 27 years should have contained. "Always be aware of your surroundings," he told her during a walk along the property line. "Notice what's different from yesterday. That's how you stay safe. Keep your promises," he emphasized, after fulfilling his pledge to build her a bookshelf despite his leg acting up. Your word is your bond. Without that, nothing else matters. Fear is just your body getting ready for action, he explained when a summer thunderstorm sent her running for the house. Acknowledge it, use it, but don't let it control you. By August, Jack moved with barely a trace of his former limp. The nightmares came less frequently. He laughed more easily. Robert and Sarah watched the transformation with quiet satisfaction, while Emma treasured each moment with her unlikely friend. Then came the letter with Army insignia on the envelope. Jack read it privately, but that evening at dinner he shared the news. I've been selected for special training, he said, his expression a mix of pride and something unreadable. I report to Fort Bragg in 2 weeks. Oh, that's wonderful, Jack, Sarah had said, though Emma could hear the concern beneath her mother's congratulations. What kind of special training? Robert asked, his own military background, giving him insight into what such a selection might mean. Jack had glanced at Emma before answering carefully. The kind that means I won't be able to write or call for a while. Security protocols. Emma didn't understand the details then, but she grasped the essential truth. Jack was leaving, and where he was going would be dangerous. The night before his departure, Jack found Emma at the old oak tree, her small figure huddled against the trunk, a book open but unread in her lap. Mind if I join you? He asked, settling beside her without waiting for an answer. They sat in companionable silence as the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Finally, Emma voiced the fear she'd been holding inside. Will you come back? Jack considered her question with the seriousness it deserved. I'll try my best, but where I'm going, I can't make promises about that. Emma nodded, tears welling in her eyes despite her effort to be brave. But I can promise you this, Jack continued, reaching into his pocket. No matter where I am, if you ever truly need me, I'll find a way to help you. He withdrew a set of dog tags on a chain. Not his current military ID, but an older set that held significant meaning to him. These were my father's from Vietnam, he explained, placing them in her small hand. I want you to keep them. But they're important to you, Emma protested. Exactly. Jack closed her fingers around the metal tags. And now you're important to me, too. There's a number engraved on the back. Not a regular phone number, but a special one. If you're ever in real trouble, the kind no one else can help with, you call that number. It will find me wherever I am. Promise, Emma had asked, slipping the chain over her head, the tags far too large for her child's frame. I promise, Jack said solemnly, but it's only for real emergencies. Life or death. Understand? Emma nodded, recognizing the gravity of what he was entrusting to her. The next morning, Jack Reeves drove away from Maple Ridge Farm in a government-issued vehicle, his few possessions packed efficiently in a single duffel bag. Emma stood at the end of the driveway, the dog tags hidden beneath her shirt, watching until his car disappeared around the bend. The letters came sporadically after that, from Fort Bragg, initially then with APO addresses, that her father explained meant Jack was overseas. The contents were general, deliberately vague about his activities, but warm in their inquiries about her life and the farm. Then in 1993, the letters stopped. No explanation, no final message. Her parents made discreet inquiries through Robert's old military connections, but received only bureaucratic responses about classified assignments. Emma continued to wear the dog tags, though she never showed them to anyone, not even her parents. As she grew older, the chain lengthened to accommodate her height, but the tags themselves remained a constant pressing against her skin beneath her clothes, a reminder of the man who had changed her understanding of courage and commitment. Now, 8 years after Jack had driven away from Maple Ridge, Emma twisted her bound wrists against the rough bark of the oak tree rain, soaking her to the skin as lightning illuminated the empty field around her. The cheap flip phone she'd purchased with babysitting money felt slippery in her fingers as she dialed the number she'd memorized years ago, the one engraved on the back of dog tags she still wore every day. This is an emergency protocol, a mechanical voice answered. Verification required. Emma's voice shook, partly from cold and partly from fear that after all these years the number would lead nowhere. Wilson Emma, Maple Ridge Farm, code Oakfield 91. There was a pause, then a series of clicks, and then impossibly a human voice, deep, familiar despite the years, but edged with a hardness that hadn't been there before. Emma, what's wrong? She could barely believe it had worked. "Jack," she whispered, her voice breaking, "they tied me to the oak tree. The storm's coming. I can't get free." There was a brief silence, then his tone shifted, a steel edge replacing the warmth. "Where exactly? Give me landmarks, distance from the farm." "The old oak in the east field, half a mile from the house near Miller's Creek." "Stay calm. I'm coming." His voice was rock steady, but she could hear barked orders in the background, the sound of movement. "Don't hang up. Keep the line open." 8,000 miles away in a classified location that wouldn't appear on any public map, Lieutenant Colonel Jack Reeves lowered the secure phone from his ear and turned to the four men seated around a makeshift tactical table. Their faces streaked with desert camouflage paint showed no reaction to the sudden interruption of their mission briefing. "Gentlemen," Jack said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command, "we have a Protocol Omega situation. Wheels up in 20. Not one of the elite operators questioned the order or asked for details. Protocol Omega was rarely invoked, a special dispensation for operators with family emergencies requiring command-level authorization and an extension of service commitment in exchange for immediate extraction from the field. As his team moved with practiced efficiency to prepare for departure, Jack Reeves stared at the map before him. Not of the Middle Eastern terrain they had been studying, but of a small Ohio town where a girl he'd once promised to protect was now fighting for her life against both human cruelty and the elements. "I'm coming, Emma," he whispered, though the connection had already been transferred to a support team who would keep her on the line until he reached her. "Hold on." The storm that had been building over Oakfield was more than just weather. It was the collision of worlds. The world of family farms in small-town America with the world of corporate agriculture. The world of high school social hierarchies with the world of military precision and loyalty. The world of a young girl's vulnerability with the world of a special forces operator's lethal capability. And as lightning split the Ohio sky, illuminating Emma Wilson's determined face as she huddled against the ancient oak, those worlds were hurtling toward each other at breakneck speed. The Dawson family estate stood on 10 manicured acres at the edge of the new development north of Oakfield. Unlike the weathered farmhouses that had dotted the county for generations, the Dawson home was a modern colonial, 6,000 square feet of brick and columns with a circular driveway leading to an imposing front entrance. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a landscape garden where no vegetable had ever been grown, no chicken had ever scratched, no real work had ever been done. Inside, Brad Dawson's footsteps echoed on Italian marble as he entered the cavernous foyer, tossing his muddied football cleats onto a bench worth more than most families' monthly mortgage payments. Practice had been moved indoors due to the approaching storm, cutting short the drills he'd been counting on to sharpen his performance for the scout visit. Now that visit was postponed indefinitely, and his father would not be pleased. "Bradley, is that you?" His mother's voice drifted from somewhere upstairs, present but distant like everything else about Regina Dawson. "Yeah, Mom." Brad didn't break stride as he headed for the kitchen, where Maria, their housekeeper, would have left his protein shake in the refrigerator. Regina appeared at the top of the curved staircase, immaculate in designer loungewear, a glass of white wine in her manicured hand despite the early hour. "Your father called. He's bringing the Ohio State recruiter to dinner tonight instead of the game." Brad froze, the refrigerator door half open. "Tonight here?" "Yes, Maria's preparing steaks. Wear something presentable, please." She gestured vaguely at his practice clothes before disappearing back into her wing of the house. Brad leaned against the granite countertop, a cold weight settling in his stomach that had nothing to do with the protein shake. A private dinner meant private evaluation. No crowd cheering his name, no highlight reel of touchdown passes, just Richard Dawson's critical eyes across the dining table, measuring his son against impossible standards. The massive kitchen, with its professional-grade appliances and custom cabinetry, suddenly felt confining. Brad left his shake unfinished and climbed the stairs to his bedroom's suite, passing walls adorned with his football trophies and framed newspaper clippings celebrating Oakfield's golden arm. His bedroom was a shrine to athletic achievement shelves lined with trophies, walls covered with pennants and team photos. A signed Ohio State jersey hung in a display case, a gift from his father, intended as both inspiration and expectation. Brad sank onto the edge of his king-size bed, staring at the framed photograph on his nightstand himself at age 7, standing rigid in a suit beside his father at some political function. Even then, Richard's hand had rested on his shoulder like a weight rather than a comfort. 18 years of his life, and Brad Dawson had never known what it meant to fail. Not because he had never failed, but because in the Dawson household, failure wasn't acknowledged, it was erased, covered up, or punished until it disappeared from view. Richard Dawson had returned from Desert Storm with a Bronze Star and an unshakable conviction that the world belonged to the strong. His military bearing never softened, not even when he removed the uniform. He'd parlayed his war record into political capital, winning a seat on the town council before forging connections with Agricorp that led to his current position as regional director. The Dawson legacy, Richard often reminded his son, is built on strength. Weakness is a choice, and we don't make that choice. As a child, Brad had learned that lesson through rigorous physical training, beginning with 5 a.m. runs at age 8. As a teenager, he'd learned it through the unyielding criticism that met any performance short of excellence, whether on the football field or in the classroom. And on the rare occasions when the criticism escalated to physical discipline, he'd learned to stand straight, take the belt without flinching, and respond with a sharp, "Yes, sir." Brad's phone buzzed with an incoming text from Megan. "Did you do it, farm girl? Learn her lesson." Brad hesitated, then typed back, "Mission accomplished. Left her tied to a tree in the east field. She'll have plenty of time to reconsider her attitude." Megan's reply came quickly. "OMG, in this storm, savage." The praise should have felt good. Instead, an unfamiliar discomfort settled in Brad's chest as he stared at the message. The storm was intensifying. Beyond what had been forecast, he could hear it now. Wind lashing against his windows, rain beating a tattoo on the roof. Another text arrived, this one from Dylan. "Dude, this storm is insane. We should go back for her." Brad's jaw tightened. He'd expected this from Dylan, who'd been reluctant from the start. Dylan Cooper, with his second-hand clothes and scholarship hopes, who'd latched onto Brad as protection from the very torment Brad inflicted on others. Dylan, who'd grown up in the trailer park, but sat at the popular table because of his friendship with Brad. Dylan, who never quite understood the rules of power. "She'll be fine," Brad texted back. "Don't go soft on me now." He tossed the phone aside and walked to his window, watching the storm rage across the manicured lawn. Lightning illuminated the swimming pool and tennis court luxuries his father had installed, not because Brad wanted them, but because they were appropriate for a man of Richard Dawson's position. Behind these impressive symbols of success, the Dawson household operated on fear. Regina drank to cope with her husband's volatile temper. The staff turnover was constant, as no housekeeper or groundskeeper lasted long under Richard's exacting standards. In Brad, the golden son, the star quarterback, the heir to the Dawson legacy, wore his confidence like armor, hiding the brittle insecurity beneath. Last night, Richard had summoned Brad to his home office after reviewing his son's latest academic progress report. "Your English grade is slipping," Richard had observed, not looking up from the paper. "B- is unacceptable. Coach says I need to focus on football right now with the scout coming," Brad had offered as explanation, standing at attention before his father's desk, a posture ingrained since childhood. "And what is Emma Wilson's grade in English?" Richard asked, finally meeting his son's eyes. The question had caught Brad off guard. "What, Emma Wilson? Robert Wilson's daughter. The farm girl. What is her grade?" "I don't know, sir. An A, probably. She's a poem. An A plus," Richard interrupted, tossing a different paper onto the desk. "Principal Morris shared the academic rankings with the board. She's top of your class. A girl who milks cows before school is outperforming my son." The humiliation had burned through Brad, followed quickly by defensive anger. "Those types just study all the time. They don't have social lives, or they have work ethic." Richard cut him off again. Something that used to be a Dawson family trait. He stood coming around the desk to face his son directly. "When I was your age, I was already enlisted, earning top marks in training while carrying a full pack in the Georgia heat. Meanwhile, you're letting some dirt farmer's daughter show you up in a classroom with air conditioning." The comparison hung in the air between them, as it always did. Brad's comfortable life against Richard's military sacrifice. Brad's athletic achievements against Richard's Bronze Star. Brad's academic performance against Richard's rise through the ranks of both military and civilian leadership. "I expect better," Richard had concluded, dismissing his son with a wave. "Don't embarrass me in front of the Ohio State recruiter." Now, as thunder shook the house, Brad's phone buzzed again. A text from his father. "Dinner at 7, wear your letter jacket, and remember Dawson's don't lose." Brad stared at the message, then back out at the storm. Somewhere out there, Emma Wilson was tied to a tree, rain soaking her clothes, wind whipping around her. He had put her there to punish her for outshining him, for threatening the narrative of superiority his father had constructed. A flash of doubt crossed his mind. What if the storm was worse than predicted? What if no one found her until morning? He pushed the thought away. Emma wasn't his problem. She was a chess piece in the game his father had taught him to play, a game where power was the only currency that mattered and those without it were merely obstacles to be removed. Brad turned from the window and headed to his closet to select a shirt for dinner. The recruiter from Ohio State would be impressed. His father would be satisfied, at least temporarily. The Dawson legacy would continue. And if there was a cost to be paid for maintaining that legacy, someone else would pay it. That was the way of the world, according to Richard Dawson, and Brad had learned his lessons well. Megan Foster's attraction to Brad Dawson had begun in 7th grade when he'd selected her as a lab partner in science class. Before that, she'd been invisible, neither pretty enough to be popular nor smart enough to be noteworthy. But Brad had chosen her, and suddenly she existed. By high school, Megan had perfected the art of being Brad's satellite. She laughed at his jokes, admired his athletic prowess, and most importantly, enabled his cruelty toward others. It was a small price to pay for protection. After all, standing beside Brad meant no one would target her. Now, as she sat in her bedroom, watching the storm intensify, Megan scrolled through her social media accounts, carefully curating her online presence to emphasize her connection to Brad and the social status it conferred. She posted a carefully filtered selfie taken earlier in his truck, captioned "Storm Day Adventures with the Squad." She deliberately didn't mention what those adventures had entailed, leaving Emma Wilson tied to a tree in the midst of what was rapidly becoming the worst storm Oakfield had seen in decades. That particular detail remained in the private text conversation with Brad, where he'd confirmed the deed was done. Unlike Brad, who dismissed any concern about Emma's safety, Megan felt a twinge of unease as she watched tree branches thrashing outside her window. The weather report on her laptop now showed a severe thunderstorm warning with potential for flash flooding in low-lying areas. The east field where they'd left Emma was on a slight rise, so flooding probably wasn't an immediate danger. But the temperature had dropped dramatically, and the wind. Megan's phone rang, startling her. Dylan's name flashed on the screen. "Have you seen the weather report?" Dylan asked without preamble when she answered. "It's just a thunderstorm," Megan replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "They've upgraded it to potential tornado conditions," Dylan said. "My dad says it's the worst system he's seen since '98. We need to go back for her." Megan glanced at her most recent text from Brad. "Don't go soft on me now." "Brad says she'll be fine," Megan countered. "It's just a few hours." "In near freezing rain with 60-mile-an-hour winds, she could die, Megan." The word hung in the air between them. Die. Not be uncomfortable, not be scared, not be taught a lesson, but die. "You're overreacting," Megan said, but even to her own ears, the words sounded hollow. "I'm going back," Dylan declared, "with or without you and Brad. I left my knife within reach, but with this wind, it might have blown away. I need to make sure she can get free." Megan bit her lip, torn between the safety of Brad's approval and the growing knot of guilt in her stomach. "Brad will never forgive you if you go against him on this." "I'll never forgive myself if something happens to her," Dylan shot back. "Make your choice, Megan. I'm leaving in 10 minutes. The line went dead, leaving Megan staring at her phone. On her laptop screen, the weather radar showed bands of intense red and purple sweeping across Oakfield County. The wind howled outside her window, drowning out the sound of her mother calling her for dinner. Megan looked again at the selfie she'd posted, her smile carefree, her eyes bright with the thrill of being included. Then she opened her text thread with Brad, typing and erasing 3 different messages before finally sending, "Dylan's going back for Emma. Storm's worse than we thought." She waited, watching the 3 dots that indicated Brad was typing a response, but they disappeared without a message coming through. Seconds stretched into a minute, then 2. Finally, her phone buzzed. "Let him. His funeral." Megan stared at the 3 words, feeling the weight of the choice before her. Stay safe in Brad's orbit, or risk everything to do what she knew was right. Outside, the storm intensified, wind and rain battering against her window, like nature itself was demanding an answer. Dylan Cooper had never intended to become one of the bad guys. Growing up in Oakfield's only trailer park, he'd learned early that social hierarchies were real and immutable. His mother worked double shifts at the hospital as a nurse's aide, his father long gone before Dylan could form memories of him. Hand-me-down clothes and free school lunches marked him as different from kids like Brad Dawson, whose designer clothes and expensive gear set them apart like a different species. In elementary school, Dylan had been a frequent target, shoved on the playground, mocked for his worn shoes, excluded from birthday parties. By middle school, he'd developed a strategy, become useful to those in power. His natural athletic ability had earned him a spot on the football team where he played defensive back to Brad's quarterback. His quick wit made him valuable in social situations, and his willingness to go along with whatever Brad suggested gave him protection. It was a devil's bargain, and Dylan knew it. He'd watched as others were targeted, kids like Emma Wilson, who didn't have the option of conforming their way into safety. He participated, laughing at Brad's jokes, standing by during confrontations, occasionally adding his own taunts to maintain his position. But leaving Emma tied to a tree in a storm that had crossed a line he hadn't realized still existed within him. Now as Dylan pulled on a heavy raincoat and grabbed his father's mag light from the kitchen drawer, he felt a resolve crystallizing that had been building for months. Brad Dawson was not a friend worth having, not at this price. His phone buzzed with a text from Brad. "Stay out of it, not your problem." Dylan didn't bother responding. He pocketed the phone and headed for the door, nearly colliding with his mother coming in from her shift, rainwater dripping from her hospital scrubs. "Where are you going in this weather?" she asked, concern etching lines around her tired eyes. Dylan hesitated. His mother had enough burdens without adding his moral failings to the list. "Left something important at school. I'll be quick." She looked skeptical, but too exhausted to argue. "Be careful. Roads are flooding already." Outside, the full force of the storm hit Dylan like a physical blow. Wind-driven rain stung his face as he mounted his motorbike, the only transportation he could afford on his part-time grocery store salary. Starting it in this weather would be a challenge, but he had no choice. The East Field was 3 miles away, much too far to reach on foot in time. As he kick-started the engine, headlights swept across the trailer park entrance. A red pickup truck pulled alongside him, and through the rain-streaked window, Dylan saw Megan's face, pale but determined. "Get in," she mouthed, gesturing to the passenger side. Dylan hesitated only a moment before abandoning his bike and climbing into the truck. The warmth inside was instant relief from the biting cold of the rain. "I thought you were staying out of it," he said, wiping water from his face. Megan's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. "I thought a lot of things that turned out to be wrong." She put the truck in drive, navigating carefully through the flooded trailer park entrance. "Brad's gone completely crazy about this. When I told him the storm was dangerous, it was like he didn't care if she got hurt." "He doesn't," Dylan said flatly. "That's who he's always been. We just pretended not to notice because it was easier." The truth of the statement hung between them as Megan guided the truck through Oakfield's deserted streets. The storm had driven everyone indoors. Even the usual Friday night crowds at the diner and movie theater were absent. Traffic lights swayed dangerously in the wind, and debris, branches, trash cans, a child's bicycle littered the roadway. As they reached the eastern edge of town, the conditions worsened. Fields that had been dry that morning, there were now shallow lakes, and the access road they needed to reach the oak tree was already partially submerged. "I don't think we can drive all the way," Megan said, slowing, as water splashed up around the truck's tires. "We'll have to go on foot from here." Dylan nodded, zipping his raincoat up to his chin. "About a quarter mile to the tree from here. Stay close, visibility is almost zero." They left the truck on a slight rise where the flooding was minimal and set out across the field, fighting against wind that threatened to knock them off their feet. The maglight's beam barely penetrated the sheets of rain, and twice Dylan had to grab Megan's arm to keep her from stumbling into deeper water. "There!" Megan suddenly shouted, pointing ahead where a massive shape loomed against the stormy sky, the ancient oak tree, its branches thrashing violently in the gale. But as they slogged closer through mud that sucked at their boots, Dylan's heart sank. The trunk of the oak tree stood empty, the ropes that had bound Emma now hanging loose, whipping in the wind like angry snakes. Emma Wilson was gone. Thousands of miles away in a forward operating base that didn't officially exist, Lieutenant Colonel Jack Reeves moved with controlled urgency through the dimly lit operations center. 8 years in Delta Force had honed his ability to project calm even in the most chaotic situations, but inside a cold fury drove every step. The mission they'd just completed, extracting a high-value intelligence asset from a heavily guarded compound, should have been followed by mandatory rest and debrief. Instead, Jack was initiating a protocol that only a handful of operators had ever used. Protocol Omega, he informed the base commander, a grizzled full-bird colonel whose weathered face betrayed no surprise at the request. Authorization Bravo 6 Delta 97. The commander nodded once, turning to his computer to verify the code. Protocol Omega was a rarely granted concession to the reality that even elite operators had families of mechanism, allowing for emergency return to the States when a genuine life-or-death situation involved an operator's immediate family. What few knew was that the protocol had a broader definition of family than blood relations alone. A Delta operator could designate up to 3 individuals for Omega protection, people who, for whatever reason, the operator considered essential to their personal stability and mission readiness. 8 years ago, Jack had listed Emma Wilson as one of his 3. Authorization confirmed, the commander said, pushing a tablet across the desk for Jack's digital signature. Stipulation reminder 6-month extension of current deployment cycle upon return. Jack signed without hesitation. 6 more months in this desert hellhole was nothing compared to breaking his promise to Emma. "You'll take your team?" the commander asked, though it wasn't really a question. Delta operators functioned as a unit, their bonds forged through shared danger and absolute interdependence. "Affirmative," Jack confirmed. "We'll need transport to Ramstein, then commercial to States. Estimated time from wheels up to target location." The commander's fingers moved rapidly over his keyboard. 16 hours minimum, assuming weather cooperation at all points, which isn't looking promising. He turned the screen, showing a weather map of the Midwestern United States. "Major system moving through your target area. High winds, potential tornado activity." Jack's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 16 hours. Emma would be alone in that storm for 16 hours. "Make it 12, he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. The commander studied him for a moment and then nodded. "I'll see what I can do. Go brief your team." Outside the command center, 4 men waited with the patient stillness that marked elite operators the ability to conserve energy while remaining perfectly alert. Each carried a rucksack already packed with essential gear, ready for immediate deployment. Master Sergeant Miguel Ramirez, weapons specialist, was cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a knife that technically wasn't supposed to exist. Staff Sergeant James Cooper, the team medic, was reviewing something on a tablet, probably medical protocols for whatever situation they were heading into. Sergeant First Class David Mitchell, communications expert, was making minute adjustments to equipment only he fully understood. And Sergeant Eric Jensen, their transportation and infiltration specialist, was simply weighting his Midwestern features impassive. "Gentlemen," Jack addressed them without preamble, "we have a Protocol Omega situation. Wheels up in 20. None of them asked for details. They didn't need to. Each man on the team had signed the same form designating their own Omega contacts. Each understood that whatever awaited them was personal to Jack, which made it personal to all of them. "Timeline," Cooper asked, already mentally cataloging what medical supplies might be needed. 12 hours to target, Jack replied. "Weather complications at the destination." "Loadout," Ramirez inquired, referring to what equipment they would bring. "Civilian compatible only. We're entering a domestic environment." Jack's expression remained neutral, but his team knew him well enough to recognize the tension in his shoulders. "This is strictly volunteer. Anyone who stays behind will face no repercussions." Jensen snorted, breaking the tension. "With respect, sir, that's bullshit, and you know it. Where you go, we go." The others nodded in agreement, already moving to prepare for departure. No further discussion was needed. Jack turned to Jensen as the others dispersed. "You're from Ohio originally, correct?" Jensen's eyebrow raised slightly. "Yes, sir. Small town outside Columbus." "Why?" "Our destination is Oakfield. Does that mean anything to you?" A shadow crossed Jensen's usually stoic face. "Oakfield County, yes, sir. I know it well. My family had a farm there until 1998. Had Agricorp bought it after my father died. My mother couldn't manage alone." Jensen's tone remained professional, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. Richard Dawson was the company representative who handled the purchase, offered 30% below market value, knowing she had no choice. Jack processed this information, filing it away. Richard Dawson is still there, now regional director for Agricorp. Jensen's eyes narrowed slightly. Is he relevant to our mission, sir? Potentially. His son is involved in the situation. Understanding dawned on Jensen's face. Like father, like son, I'm guessing. Jack didn't confirm or deny, but his silence was answer enough. Be ready in 15, he said instead, turning to make his own preparations. As the team dispersed to gather their gear, Jack took a moment alone, removing a worn photograph from his wallet. It showed a much younger version of himself standing beside a small blonde girl in overalls, both of them smiling beneath the spreading branches of an oak tree. He studied it briefly, then returned it to his wallet with a renewed sense of purpose. 16 hours was too long, but it was all they had. The rope cut deeper into Emma's wrist as she struggled, the rain plastering her hair to her face and lightning periodically illuminating the empty field around her. The oak tree offered minimal shelter, its summer foliage long since thinned by autumn winds. Each gust sent icy water cascading down her back, and her fingers were growing numb from cold and restricted circulation. The cheap flip phone, her only lifeline, was clutched awkwardly in her bound hands behind the tree trunk. The support team that had taken over her call, with Jack identifying themselves only as tactical response, remained on the line, their voices calm and methodical as they asked questions about her exact location, physical condition, and immediate surroundings. Temperature is dropping, Emma managed through chattering teeth. Maybe 40 degrees now. Rain's turning to sleet. Understood, the disembodied voice replied. Hypothermia risk increasing. Can you describe the restraints again? Emma twisted her head, trying to see the ropes. Standard nylon rope, quarter-inch, triple knotted. They used a lot around my wrists, then around the tree trunk, then around my waist. And the knife, you mentioned someone left a knife nearby. About 6 feet away, Emma confirmed, squinting through the rain. On a rock, but it might have blown away by now. I can't see it anymore. Lightning split the sky directly overhead, followed almost instantly by a deafening crack of thunder that Emma felt in her bones. The storm was intensifying, the wind now strong enough to bend smaller trees nearly double. The ancient oak groaned above her, its massive branches swaying alarmingly. Emma, the voice on the phone said, using her name for the first time, I need you to focus on staying warm. Tuck your chin to your chest to conserve body heat. Keep wiggling your fingers and toes to maintain circulation. Lieutenant Colonel Reeves and his team are en route, estimated arrival in 12 hours. 12 hours. Emma's heart sank. The temperature was dropping by the minute, the rain showing no signs of letting up. 12 hours in these conditions would be a death sentence. I don't think I have 12 hours, she admitted, her voice small against the howling wind. There was a brief silence on the line. Understood. Local assets are being explored. Continue to, the voice cut off suddenly, replaced by static. Emma's stomach dropped as she realized the cheap phone was losing signal in the storm. Hello, are you there? She called desperately, but the static only intensified before the line went dead completely. The phone's screen flickered, then displayed a critical battery warning before going dark. Alone in the storm, Emma fought against rising panic. Jack was coming, but too late. Her parents wouldn't miss her until dinner, and with the roads flooding, they might assume she was staying at a friend's house. No one knew where she was. No one except Brad, Megan, and Dylan. The thought of her tormentors brought a surge of anger that temporarily cut through the cold. She twisted her wrists against the rope with renewed determination, ignoring the pain as the rough fibers scraped her skin raw. Jack had taught her never to give up, to use everything available to her advantage. What did she have? Rope that was getting soaked and might stretch. A tree with rough bark that might fray the fibers. And the knowledge that the human body was capable of more than most people believed possible. Emma began methodically working her wrists up and down against the bark, using the tree itself as a saw against the rope. Each movement sent pain shooting up her arms, but she continued remembering Jack's words. Pain is information. Use it, don't fear it. Time became meaningless, measured only in the rhythmic scrape of rope against bark and the decreasing feeling in her extremities. The cold was a living thing, now seeping into her bones, making each movement more difficult than the last. But still she persisted, driven by a determination that went beyond mere survival. She would not be a victim. She would not be defeated by Brad Dawson or this storm. A particularly violent gust of wind sent a branch crashing down nearby, startling Emma from her focused work. The sound of splintering wood was followed by an ominous creak from above. One of the oak's massive limbs was beginning to split near the trunk, weakened by the relentless wind. If it fell, it would crush her. Emma redoubled her efforts, desperation lending strength to her numbed arms. The rope felt looser now, whether from her sawing motion against the bark or from the water causing the fibers to expand, she couldn't tell. But it was something. With a final painful twist, one hand slipped free of the restraint. Emma nearly cried out in relief, quickly working to free her other hand and then the rope around her waist. Her fingers, clumsy with cold, fumbled with the knots, but finally she was free. For a moment, she simply leaned against the tree, catching her breath and allowing blood to flow back into her hands, a process accompanied by excruciating pins and needles. Then the splitting sound from above intensified, and Emma threw herself away from the trunk just as the massive branch came crashing down, landing exactly where she had been standing seconds before. The impact sent a shudder through the ground, mud splashing up around Emma as she lay sprawled in the flooded field. Rain lashed at her face as she struggled to her feet, disorientation momentarily overwhelming her. Which direction was home? In the darkness and driving rain, all landmarks had disappeared. Lightning flashed again briefly, illuminating the landscape. Emma caught a glimpse of higher ground to her left, the rise that led toward Maple Ridge Farm. She began slogging in that direction, each step a battle against mud that sucked at her shoes and wind that threatened to knock her off her feet. The cold was becoming dangerous now. Emma's wet clothes offered no protection against the wind chill, and her limbs were growing increasingly unresponsive. She knew the signs of hypothermia, confusion, loss of coordination, eventual drowsiness that would lead to unconsciousness and death if she succumbed to it. "Keep moving," she muttered aloud, forcing one foot in front of the other. "Just keep moving." A distant light caught her attention, headlights perhaps on the access road that ran alongside the field. Emma changed course, hoping it might be her parents searching for her, or even a stranger who could help. As she drew closer, she could make out the shape of a pickup truck, its headlights cutting twin beams through the rain. Two figures were moving away from it into the field, heading toward the oak tree she had just escaped. "Hey," Emma shouted, but her voice was lost in the howling wind. She waved her arms and continued toward the lights, stumbling as her foot caught in a hidden depression. The fall saved her life. As Emma went down a massive section of sheet metal, torn from a barn roof, by the wind went sailing through the air, exactly where her head had been moments before. It struck the ground with enough force to embed itself 6 inches into the mud, vibrating like a giant tuning fork. Emma lay still, stunned by her narrow escape, her heart pounding in her ears. The storm was becoming not just dangerous, but deadly, and she was still at least a quarter-mile from the road. Gathering herself, she rose again, more carefully this time, scanning for airborne debris. The lights from the truck were still visible, and she resumed her journey toward them, desperate for any human contact and assistance. She had covered perhaps 50 yards when another flash of lightning revealed a figure running toward her, someone who had spotted her and was coming to help. Relief flooded through Emma, giving her a burst of energy. "Here," she called, waving her arms again. "I'm here." The figure drew closer, resolving into a familiar shape. Dylan Cooper, his face a mask of concern and guilt beneath the hood of his rain jacket. "Emma," he shouted when he was close enough to be heard over the storm. "Thank God you got free. Are you hurt?" Before she could answer, a second figure appeared beside him. Megan Foster, her makeup streaked by rain, her expression shocked. "You're alive," Megan said as if she'd expected otherwise. "How did you No time," Dylan interrupted, removing his rain jacket and wrapping it around Emma's shoulders. "We need to get to the truck. This storm is getting worse by the minute." Emma wanted to refuse their help. These were the people who had put her in danger in the first place, but survival instinct overrode pride. She allowed Dylan to support her as they made their way back toward the truck, Megan following closely behind. "I'm sorry," Dylan said as they walked, his voice barely audible above the storm. "I should never have gone along with it. There's no excuse." Emma didn't respond. Her energy was focused entirely on putting one foot in front of the other, fighting the cold that threatened to shut down her body systems. Conversation and forgiveness could wait. They had nearly reached the truck when a flash of lightning illuminated another vehicle approaching on the access road, a familiar red pickup with a lift kit and oversized tires. Brad Dawson's truck. Oh no, Megan whispered, fear evident in her voice. He said he was staying home. The truck skidded to a halt beside Megan's vehicle, and Brad emerged, his leather jacket offering little protection against the storm. His face, illuminated by the headlights, showed a mixture of anger and something else, fear perhaps, though whether for Emma or himself wasn't clear. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted at Dylan and Megan. "I told you to stay out of this." Dylan positioned himself between Brad and Emma, his stance protective. "She could have died out here, Brad. Look at her, she's hypothermic." Brad's gaze shifted to Emma, taking in her bedraggled appearance, the blue tinge to her lips, the violent shivering that racked her body despite Dylan's jacket. For a moment, something like regret flashed across his face. Then his expression hardened again. "She got herself free. She's fine. We need to go, all of us, before anyone connects us to this." "Connects us?" Megan repeated incredulously. "Brad, we tied her to a tree in a tornado-level storm. That's attempted murder." "It was a prank that got out of hand," Brad countered, rain streaming down his face. "No one will believe her word against ours, but only if we stick together on this." He focused on Emma again. "We'll drive you home. You fell in the creek trying to cross it in the storm. That's what happened. Understand?" Emma stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. Even now, faced with the consequences of his actions, Brad was thinking only of himself. "Go to hell," she managed through chattering teeth. Brad's face darkened. He took a step toward her, but Dylan moved to intercept him. "Back off, Brad," Dylan warned. "It's over." For a tense moment, it seemed Brad might escalate the confrontation. Then lightning struck a power line less than 50 yards away, sending a shower of sparks into the air and illuminating the scene with eerie blue light. "Fine," Brad spat, retreating toward his truck. "You want to throw everything away for Farm Girl, your choice. But don't come crying when she ruins all our lives." He climbed into his pickup and gunned the engine, executing a reckless three-point turn that sent mud spraying from his tires before roaring off into the storm. "We need to get her warm now," Dylan said, helping Emma toward Megan's truck. "Crank the heat as high as it will go." Inside the cab, Emma huddled in the passenger seat, shivering uncontrollably as Megan turned the heater to maximum. The warm air felt like fire against her frozen skin, painful but necessary. "Hospital or home?" Megan asked, putting the truck in drive. Emma considered. The hospital would mean questions she wasn't ready to answer, especially with Jack and his team still hours away. "Home," she decided. "My parents can help." Megan nodded, navigating carefully onto the flooded access road. The truck's headlights revealed water nearly axle deep in places, but the vehicle was high enough to push through. "I'm sorry," Megan said suddenly, her eyes fixed on the road. "I know that doesn't help, but I am. I got caught up in, I don't even know what. Being someone I'm not, I guess." Emma said nothing, focusing on the warmth slowly returning to her extremities. The pain was excruciating as circulation returned, but with it came clarity of thought. She thought of Brad racing home to construct his alibi, of Dylan and Megan risking Brad's wrath to come back for her, of her parents who would be frantic by now, and of Jack crossing continents to keep a promise made years ago. The storm continued to rage around them, but inside the truck, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that would change Oakfield forever once it broke. Robert Wilson stood at the kitchen window of Maple Ridge Farm, watching the storm lash at the fields he had worked his entire life. Sarah moved behind him, the portable radio in her hand, broadcasting the latest weather updates. "Flash flood warning extended until midnight." The announcer's voice crackled through static. "Residents in low-lying areas are advised to seek higher ground immediately. Power outages reported throughout Oakfield County." "She should have been home hours ago," Sarah said, worry etching lines in her face. "I've tried the school, but the phones are down." Robert's jaw tightened, his calloused hands gripping the windowsill. "Roads are flooded. Maybe she stayed with a friend in town." Neither of them voiced the fear that grew with each passing minute that their daughter was caught somewhere in the most violent storm to hit Oakfield in decades. The sound of an engine outside drew them both to the door. Through sheets of rain, headlights approached up the long driveway, moving slowly through standing water that had transformed their yard into a shallow lake. "That's not our truck," Robert observed, grabbing a flashlight and rain gear. "Stay here, I'll check." But Sarah was already following him out onto the porch, rain immediately soaking through her sweater. "It could be news about Emma," she said, her tone brooking no argument. Together they watched as a pickup truck they didn't recognize pulled up to the house. The passenger door opened and a figure emerged, small, bedraggled, but unmistakably their daughter. "Emma!" Sarah cried, rushing down the porch steps, heedless of the rain and floodwater. Robert was right behind her, reaching Emma, just as the girl's legs seemed to give out. He caught her, lifting her easily despite his age, alarmed at how cold she felt, even through her wet clothes. "Inside now," he ordered, carrying Emma toward the house while Sarah hurried ahead to prepare blankets and hot water. Dylan and Megan followed hesitantly, stopping at the foot of the porch steps. "She needs to get warm," Dylan called over the storm. "She's been outside for hours." Robert paused, taking in these strangers who had brought his daughter home. Questions burned in his mind, but they could wait. "Come inside," he said gruffly. "Storm's too bad to drive back." Inside the old farmhouse was a flurry of activity. Sarah had already laid blankets before the wood stove in the living room and was heating water for tea. Robert placed Emma gently on the couch, alarmed at her blue-tinged lips and violent shivering. "What happened?" he demanded, turning to Dylan and Megan, who hovered uncertainly in the doorway. The two teenagers exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. It was Dylan who spoke first. "She was tied to the oak tree in the east field," he said, his voice steady despite the bomb he was dropping. "We just found her and brought her home." Robert's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flashed in his eyes. "Pshilhon?" He repeated the single word, carrying the weight of a threat. Megan stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "Brad Dawson did it. We helped him. It was wrong and we're sorry, but right now Emma needs medical attention." Sarah gasped, nearly dropping the kettle she was carrying. "You tied my daughter to a tree in this storm?" Emma stirred on the couch, her eyes opening. "Mom," she managed, her voice weak. "I'm okay, just cold." Sarah set down the kettle and knelt beside her daughter, the maternal instinct temporarily overriding her shock and anger. "We need to get these wet clothes off you," she said, already working to remove Emma's soaked jacket. "Robert, bring my thermal pajamas from upstairs. And call Dr. Matthews." Robert hesitated, clearly torn between caring for his daughter and dealing with the teenagers who had admitted to endangering her life. Finally, he nodded curtly and headed for the stairs, pausing beside Dylan and Megan. "You two stay right here," he said, his farmer's hands capable of gentle care for newborn animals and bruising force when necessary, clenching at his sides. "We're not done talking about this." As Robert disappeared upstairs, Sarah continued helping Emma out of her wet clothes, wrapping her in warm blankets. Her nursing training from years before took over her movements, efficient despite the trembling of her hands. "How long were you out there?" she asked, rubbing Emma's arms through the blankets to generate friction heat. "Few hours," Emma murmured, her teeth still chattering. "Got free when a branch fell." Sarah's eyes widened in horror at the implications. If the branch had fallen differently. "The phones are down," Megan offered hesitantly. "But I have a satellite phone in my truck. My dad makes me carry it for emergencies." Sarah looked up, momentarily surprised by the offer from one of her daughter's tormentors. "Get it," she ordered. "We need to call Dr. Matthews." As Megan hurried out to her truck, Dylan remained in the doorway, his expression a mixture of guilt and concern. "I left a knife," he said, addressing Emma directly. "I thought you'd be able to reach it. I'm sorry it wasn't closer." Emma managed a weak nod, neither accepting nor rejecting his apology. Her mind was on something else entirely. "Mom," she said, her voice slightly stronger as warmth began returning to her body. "I called someone. Before I got free. He's coming." Sarah frowned, tucking the blankets more securely around her daughter. "Who, sweetheart? Who did you call?" Emma's eyes drifted closed, exhaustion claiming her now that she was safe. "Jack," she whispered. "Jack Reeves." Sarah froze her hand on Emma's forehead. She exchanged a look with Dylan, who seemed confused by the name, then glanced toward the stairs where Robert was returning with clothes and a first aid kit. "Robert," she called, her voice strained. She called Jack. Robert paused on the last step, understanding immediately. "Jack Reeves, how, when?" "I don't know," Sarah replied, turning back to Emma, who had drifted into an exhausted sleep. "But she says he's coming." Outside, the storm continued to rage, unaware that it was no longer the most dangerous force converging on Oakfield. Somewhere over the Atlantic, a military transport plane, carrying 5 Delta Force operators, was fighting through the same weather system, racing against time to reach a small Ohio town where promises made would finally be kept. The Maple Ridge farmhouse stood like a fortress against the storm, its century-old foundation unmoved by the wind that howled around its eaves. Inside the living room had been transformed into a makeshift infirmary. Emma Wilson lay on the couch wrapped in thermal blankets, color slowly returning to her face, as her mother checked her vital signs with the practiced efficiency of a former nurse. Robert Wilson stood by the wood stove feeding another log into the crackling fire. His weathered face betrayed little emotion, but the tension in his shoulders and the careful way he avoided looking directly at Dylan Cooper and Megan Foster, seated awkwardly at the kitchen table, spoke volumes about the restraint he was exercising. The satellite phone Megan had retrieved from her truck sat on the coffee table, Dr. Matthews having confirmed he would arrive as soon as road conditions permitted. The ancient grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, counting down minutes that seemed to stretch into hours. Her temperature's up to 96, Sarah reported, removing a digital thermometer from Emma's ear. Still hypothermic, but improving. Robert nodded, his eyes finally shifting to the teenagers at his table. Now, he said, his voice deceptively calm, I want to hear exactly what happened. Every detail. Dylan and Megan exchanged glances, their faces pale in the golden lamplight that illuminated the room. The storm had knocked out power to the entire county, but the Wilsons' generator hummed steadily outside a precaution installed after the blizzard of '97. Mr. Wilson, Dylan began, his hands clasped tightly before him. It was wrong, all of it. We shouldn't have. I didn't ask for your regrets, Robert interrupted, not unkindly but firmly. I asked what happened. Dylan swallowed hard, then nodded. It started with Emma's history paper about family farms and corporate agriculture. Mrs. Henderson read part of it to the class yesterday, and Brad Dawson took it personally because his dad works for AgriCorp. Richard Dawson's boy, Robert stated, rather than asked, his expression darkening slightly. Yes, sir, Megan confirmed, finding her voice. Brad was already angry because the football game was canceled and there was a scout coming from Ohio State. Then his father compared him to Emma, said he was being outperformed academically by a farm girl. She faltered at the last words, realizing how they sounded in this house. And so they decided to teach my daughter a lesson. Sarah said, her tone carrying a sharpness rarely heard from the usually gentle woman. Brad decided, Dylan corrected, though the distinction offered little comfort. Megan and I went along with it. I tried to warn Emma earlier today, but Brad caught me, said I needed to prove my loyalty. Robert's gaze shifted to his daughter, who was now awake and listening silently, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Emma, is that how you remember it? Emma nodded weakly. They caught me walking home, forced me into Brad's truck. Dylan tried to help by leaving a knife, but she shrugged slightly, the movement causing her to wince. I got free when the rope frayed against the tree bark. And then you called Jack Reeves. Robert stated, something unreadable in his voice. How? When? I had a phone, Emma admitted. A cheap one I bought with my allowance. And I still have the dog tags he gave me with the emergency number. Sarah moved to sit beside her daughter, gently brushing damp hair from her forehead. After all these years, you've kept in touch with him. Emma shook her head. No, this was the first time I've called. He said it was only for real emergencies. Her voice broke slightly. This seemed like one. Robert turned away, ostensibly to add another log to the fire, but those who knew him well could see he was collecting himself. Jack Reeves had been gone for 8 years, during which the Wilson family had heard nothing beyond vague rumors about special operations and classified deployments. Yet Emma had maintained a connection, however tenuous, to the man who had spent one summer on their farm and changed all their lives. And he answered, Robert said, finally turning back to face the room. He's coming here. Oh, Emma nodded. With his team. They said 12 hours, maybe less now. The implications of this statement settled over the room like a physical weight. A Delta Force team, for that was surely what his team meant, was en route to Oakfield for a civilian in danger because of a promise made years ago. Dylan looked bewildered, clearly not understanding the significance, but Megan's face had drained of color. Military, she whispered. You called the military on us, not on you, Emma corrected, her voice strengthening. To save me. I didn't know if anyone would find me before. She didn't finish the sentence, but the howling wind outside completed the thought for her. Robert checked his watch, a practical timepiece that had survived decades of farm work. If they left when you called, they could be here by morning. He turned to Dylan and Megan, his expression grave. You two need to understand something. Jack Reeves isn't just any soldier. And if he's bringing a team, they're not just any unit. These are serious men who take promises very seriously. What will they do? Megan asked, fear evident in her voice. Nothing illegal, Robert assured her, though his tone suggested this was a technicality rather than a comfort. But they will want justice, and in my experience, they usually find a way to get it. The conversation was interrupted by headlights sweeping across the living room window as a vehicle pulled into the driveway. Robert moved to the window, peering out cautiously. It's Doc Matthews, he reported, reaching for his coat. I'll help him in. As Robert stepped outside into the storm, Sarah turned to the teenagers with a mother's direct gaze. I want you both to listen carefully. My husband is right. Jack Reeves and his men will want justice. But right now, I'm more concerned about Emma's health and safety. So you're going to tell the doctor exactly what happened, and then you're going to tell the sheriff when the road's clear enough for him to get here. Dylan nodded immediately. Yes, ma'am. That's why we came back for her. We knew it was wrong. Megan wiped tears from her cheeks, nodding in agreement. What about Brad? He's not going to admit to anything. Brad Dawson, Sarah said with quiet certainty, is about to learn that his father's influence has limits. The door burst open, admitting Robert and a rain-soaked Dr. Matthews, the latter, carrying an old-fashioned black medical bag that had been serving Oakfield's residents for 3 decades. The elderly doctor shook water from his coat and moved immediately to Emma's side, his experienced eyes taking in her condition with a single glance. Hypothermia, possible exposure, rope burns on the wrists, he diagnosed aloud, opening his bag. What else should I know? Emma attempted a weak smile. Just cold and tired, Doc. Nothing broken. The doctor's gentle hands belied his stern expression as he examined her, checking pupils, pulse, and the rope burns on her wrists. These will need antiseptic, he muttered, reaching for supplies. Sarah, some warm broth would help if you have it. As Sarah moved to the kitchen to prepare broth, Dr. Matthews lowered his voice, addressing Emma directly. Sheriff Potter will want to know what happened. These aren't injuries from a fall or getting caught in the storm. Emma glanced at Dylan and Megan, then back to the doctor. They came back for me, she said simply. They're trying to make it right. Dr. Matthews' eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded, understanding the complexity of small-town relationships. Well, you're lucky. Another hour out there, and we'd be having a very different conversation. As it is, you'll need rest, warmth, and time to recover from the exposure. As the doctor continued his examination, Robert moved to the kitchen doorway where he could speak privately with Dylan and Megan. Sheriff can't get through tonight. Roads are completely flooded toward town. But at first light, I'm driving you both to the station to make official statements. Neither teenager objected, though Megan looked frightened at the prospect. What about our parents? She asked. They'll be worried. Robert's expression softened slightly. Sarah will try the satellite phone again. If we can get through, we'll let them know you're safe here. But no one's driving in this storm, not even to get you home. As if to emphasize his point, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows, and something heavy, likely a tree branch, thudded against the roof. In the living room, Dr. Matthews finished bandaging Emma's wrists and administered an injection of antibiotics as a precaution. Keep her warm, plenty of fluids, and watch for fever, he instructed Sarah, packing his bag. I'd take her to the hospital if we could get there, but frankly, she's better off here than trying to travel in this weather. Thank you for coming, Doc, Sarah said, handing him a thermos of coffee for his journey home. Be careful on the roads. As the doctor prepared to leave, Emma's voice stopped him. Doc, when Jack Reeves gets here, he might need your help too. Dr. Matthews paused, his expression curious. Jack Reeves, Robert's army friend from years back. He's returning. Emma nodded, and something in her eyes made the elderly doctor study her more closely. I see, he said finally, though clearly he didn't entirely. Well, my door is always open to anyone who needs help. After the doctor departed, braving the storm once more, a strange calm settled over the farmhouse. The wind continued to howl, the rain to lash at the windows, but inside a sense of waiting had replaced the initial crisis. Emma drifted into an exhausted sleep while her parents took turns keeping watch. Dylan and Megan eventually succumbed to fatigue as well, curled awkwardly in armchairs pulled close to the fire. It was in these quiet hours with only the storm and the ticking clock for company that Robert Wilson allowed himself to remember the summer of 1991 when a wounded soldier had brought both healing and complication to Maple Ridge Farm. 6,000 miles away, the military transport carrying Jack Reeves and his team fought through turbulence that threatened to shake the aircraft apart. The C-17 Globemaster III, designed to deliver troops and cargo under combat conditions, was being pushed to its operational limits by the massive storm system that stretched from the Midwest to the eastern seaboard. In the cargo hold converted to Spartan passenger seating for this mission, Jack sat with his back against the fuselage, eyes closed but fully alert. Across from him, his team maintained similar postures of controlled rest, conserving energy while remaining ready for immediate action. The intercom crackled to life, the pilot's voice barely audible over the aircraft's straining engines. Lieutenant Colonel, we're diverting to Wright-Patterson. Storms made Columbus a no-go. ETA 90 minutes. Jack acknowledged the update with a thumbs up to the loadmaster who relayed the message forward. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton would add time to their journey to Oakfield, but it was still their best option given the deteriorating weather. Sergeant Jensen, who had been studying weather maps on a tablet, looked up at the announcement. Sir, latest radar shows the system intensifying over Oakfield County. Flash flood warnings, possible tornado activity. Jack's expression remained impassive, but his eyes, when they opened, carried an intensity that his team recognized all too well. Time from Wright-Pat to target location by ground. 3 hours minimum in these conditions, Jensen replied, assuming roads are passable, which satellite imagery suggests they're not. Jack processed this information with the efficiency of a combat veteran who had spent decades making critical decisions under pressure. Options, Master Sergeant Ramirez leaned forward. We could requisition a helicopter at Wright-Pat, sir. Get as close as the weather allows, then finish on ground transport. Weather's not going to allow much, Staff Sergeant Cooper, the medic, interjected. Ceilings too low, winds too high. Bird would be grounded. Sir, Sergeant Mitchell, the communications specialist, spoke up from where he had been monitoring a secure channel. I've been in contact with tactical response. They lost connection with the girl about an hour ago. Phone battery died. Last update indicated she had freed herself from restraints, but was showing signs of moderate hypothermia. A muscle in Jack's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Emma was free but alone in the storm, her condition deteriorating, and they were still hours away. Jensen, Jack said after a moment, you said you were from the area. Any contacts who might be able to help local law enforcement emergency services? Jensen shook his head. Sheriff's Department is understaffed and overwhelmed during normal conditions. In a storm like this, they'll be lucky to handle the major emergencies. And my family connections there ended when we lost the farm. Jack nodded, having expected this answer. Small towns like Oakfield often had limited resources, and those would be stretched to breaking during a natural disaster. There is one option, sir, Jensen added hesitantly, but you won't like it. Jack's gaze sharpened. Let's hear it. Richard Dawson, former Army, served in Desert Storm, now some kind of corporate executive and local politician. He has resources, equipment, manpower, influence. If anyone in Oakfield could reach a stranded girl in this storm, it would be him. Dawson, Jack repeated the name, stirring something in his memory. Robert Wilson mentioned him once, said he came back from the war with ambitions. Jensen nodded. That's putting it mildly, sir. He basically runs the town now, but he hesitated again, clearly uncomfortable. Speak freely, Sergeant. Well, sir, from what you've told us, it sounds like Dawson's son is involved in whatever happened to the Wilson girl. Going to Richard Dawson for help might be complicated. Jack absorbed this, his mind working through the implications. Complicated is what we do, Jensen. Make the call when we land. Use your family connection as the angle. Say nothing about our mission or the Wilson girl, just that you are returning to check on old neighbors during the storm and heard there might be people stranded in the eastern fields. Jensen nodded, understanding the strategy. Give Dawson a chance to help or to reveal himself as an obstacle. Ramirez, when we land, secure ground transportation that can handle flood conditions. Cooper, prep medical supplies for hypothermia treatment. Mitchell, keep working tactical response, see if they can get satellite imagery of the Wilson farm and surrounding area. Each man acknowledged his orders with a nod, no further discussion needed. This was how Delta Force operated. Clear objectives, adaptable tactics, absolute trust in each team member's capabilities. As the others turned to their tasks, Jack removed a waterproof case from his rucksack. Inside, protected from the elements, was a worn photograph himself and a much younger Emma Wilson standing beneath the oak tree where she had now been left to die. The image had traveled with him through war zones and black operations across 4 continents, a reminder of a promise made to a child who had shown him kindness when he needed it most. 8 years of classified missions had taught Jack Reeves the true meaning of patience. Now strapped into a military transport fighting through the worst storm system to hit the Midwest in decades, he found himself drawing on that same reserve of calm determination. He would reach Emma. He would keep his promise. And those responsible would learn that some actions have consequences that no amount of local influence could prevent. Later, Brad Dawson stood in his father's study, rainwater still dripping from his leather jacket onto the imported carpet. Richard Dawson sat behind his massive oak desk, his expression revealing nothing as he listened to his son's carefully edited account of the evening. "So you're saying the Wilson girl was caught in the storm and you attempted to help her?" Richard clarified, his tone neutral, but his eyes sharp with suspicion. "Yes, sir," Brad confirmed, maintaining eye contact as he'd been taught. "I was driving home from Dillon's when I saw her trying to cross Miller's Creek. The water was too high and she got swept in. I managed to help her to the bank, and then Megan and Dylan drove up. They said they'd take her home since it was closer to their route." Richard leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled before him. Thunder rumbled overhead, momentarily drowning out the sound of rain against the windows. "And where are Megan and Dylan now?" Brad hesitated, a mistake that didn't go unnoticed. "I assume they took her home, to the Wilson farm." "You assume?" Richard repeated, his voice hardening. "You didn't follow up, ensure she received proper medical attention. That would have been the responsible thing to do." "The roads were getting worse," Brad offered, shifting his weight slightly. "I thought it was more important to get home before the flooding got any worse." Richard Dawson studied his son with the same critical eye he'd used to evaluate junior officers during his military career. Something in Brad's story didn't add up, and Richard Dawson had built his post-military career on identifying weaknesses and inconsistencies. "Bradley," he said finally, using his son's full name, always a warning sign. "You understand that the Ohio State recruiter is a personal friend of mine, that he's staying in our guest house tonight because of this storm?" Brad swallowed, nodding. "Yes, sir. And you understand that in small towns like Oakfield, stories travel quickly. If there's anything unfortunate about this evening's events, it could reflect poorly on this family." "Yes, sir, but there's nothing to worry about. I helped her, that's all." Richard Dawson's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then why are your knuckles bruised? And why is there mud on the knees of your jeans as if you've been kneeling or wrestling with someone?" Brad glanced down at his hands, then back up, scrambling for an explanation. "From helping her out of the creek. She was panicking, fighting against the current. I had to hold her pretty firmly." The phone on Richard's desk rang, interrupting the interrogation. Richard answered it, his expression changing from suspicion to professional cordiality in an instant. "Richard Dawson speaking." He listened for a moment, then covered the mouthpiece with his hand. "Go clean up. The recruiter will be joining us for dinner in 30 minutes. We'll continue this discussion later." Brad seized the reprieve, hurrying from the study and up to his room. Once alone, he leaned against his closed door, heart racing. His carefully constructed story was already unraveling, and his father's skepticism was just the beginning. His phone buzzed with an incoming text. Brad checked it, expecting another message from Megan or Dylan. Instead, it was from a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Dawson, this is Sheriff Potter. Please call my office immediately regarding an incident reported this evening involving Emma Wilson." Brad stared at the message, a cold dread settling in his stomach. It was happening faster than he'd anticipated. Emma must have talked as soon as she got home. Another text arrived, this one from Megan. "We're at Emma's house. Her parents know everything. We're making official statements in the morning. I'm sorry, but I can't lie about this." Brad sank onto the edge of his bed, the full weight of his actions finally hitting him. He had left a classmate tied to a tree in a life-threatening storm. If she had died, and by all rights she should have in these conditions, he would be facing manslaughter charges at minimum. A senior year prank gone wrong. No jury would buy that, especially when the motive involved academic jealousy and his father's corporate connections. Brad's mind raced through options, each less viable than the last. Run. Where would he go, and how far would he get in this storm? Deny everything. It would be his word against Megan's, Dylan's, and Emma's. Confess his father would disown him before allowing him to tarnish the Dawson name with a public admission of guilt. A soft knock at his door startled him from these spiraling thoughts. Bradley, his mother's voice slightly slurred from whatever she'd been drinking all afternoon. Your father says to wear your blue blazer for dinner. The recruiter is here early. I'll be right down, Brad called back, forcing his voice to sound normal. As he changed clothes mechanically, Brad caught his reflection in the mirror. The golden boy of Oakfield's star quarterback, son of the most powerful man in the county. The image had defined him for so long that he'd never questioned whether the person behind it was someone he actually wanted to be. Now that carefully maintained image was about to shatter, and Brad Dawson had no idea who he would be when the pieces fell. The Wilson farmhouse kitchen had become a center of activity as the night progressed. Robert had rigged up the generator to power essential systems, including the satellite phone that now sat on the table, its battery charging. Sarah had prepared a simple meal of soup and homemade bread, insisting that everyone eat to keep up their strength. Emma, wrapped in blankets and propped up on the couch, managed a few spoonfuls before exhaustion claimed her again. Dylan and Megan ate silently at the kitchen table, the weight of the evening's events and tomorrow's consequences heavy on their young shoulders. Sheriff Potter says he'll meet us at the station at 8. Robert reported, hanging up the satellite phone after his latest call. Roads should be passable by then, at least the main ones. Sarah nodded, clearing dishes with the efficiency of a woman accustomed to managing household crises. And Emma's call, any word on when Jack might arrive? Robert shook his head. Tactical response confirmed his team is en route, but the storm is causing delays. They've been diverted to Wright-Patterson. Right, Pat? Dylan asked, looking up from his bowl. The Air Force Base, Robert nodded, studying the boy with newfound interest. You know it. My uncle was stationed there, Dylan explained. Air Force mechanic. It's about 3 hours from here in good weather. And this isn't good weather, Robert concluded grimly, glancing toward the windows where rain continued to lash against the glass. We should all try to get some rest. Tomorrow will be challenging. As they prepared makeshift beds in the living room for their unexpected guests, the phone rang again. Sarah answered, her expression shifting from concern to confusion. It's for you, Dylan, she said, holding out the receiver. Your mother. Dylan took the phone, his face paling. Mom, how did you know I was here? The conversation that followed was brief and one-sided, with Dylan mostly listening and occasionally saying, yes, ma'am, or I understand. When he hung up, he looked shell-shocked. What is it? Megan asked, recognizing his expression. My mom got a call from Brad's father, Dylan explained. Mr. Dawson is telling people I stole his son's truck and convinced you to go on some joyride during the storm, that we're making up stories about Brad to cover for the theft. Robert's weathered face hardened. Richard Dawson is getting ahead of the story, controlling the narrative. But it's not true, Megan protested. We came in my truck, not Brad's. And we have Emma's testimony about what really happened. Truth, Robert said with the weary wisdom of a man who had seen justice miscarried before, doesn't always win against power in places like Oakfield. But, he added, his tone shifting, Richard Dawson doesn't know what's coming. Dylan looked confused, but Megan seemed to grasp the implication. Jack Reeves, she said softly, the military man Emma called. Robert nodded, a grim satisfaction in his eyes. Jack isn't influenced by local politics or corporate donations, and he keeps his promises. Outside, the storm began to diminish, the howling wind gradually subsiding to a steady gust, the pounding rain softening to a persistent drizzle. Nature's fury was abating, but the human storm brewing in Oakfield was just beginning to gather strength. Dawn broke over Oakfield County, revealing the storm's devastation in stark morning light. Fields lay submerged under feet of standing water. Uprooted trees blocked rural roads. Power lines drooped dangerously close to flooded areas. At Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Jack Reeves and his team emerged from the military transport into the gray morning, each man carrying a standard-issue duffel that contained anything but standard equipment. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of men who had operated together in far more hostile environments than a storm-ravaged Ohio countryside. A young Air Force lieutenant approached, saluting sharply. "Lieutenant Colonel Reeves, your transportation is ready, sir." Jack returned the salute. "What's the situation on the ground?" "Flooding throughout the region, sir. Major roads are mostly clear, but rural routes are hit or miss. We've provided the vehicle you requested, high-clearance four-wheel drive with emergency equipment. GPS is programmed with your destination." The lieutenant hesitated, then added, "Sir, local authorities have established emergency protocols. Civilian movement is restricted in the worst-hit areas." Jack nodded, unsurprised. "We'll coordinate with local emergency services as needed." "Thank you, Lieutenant." The vehicle turned out to be a modified Humvee with civilian markings, less conspicuous than a military vehicle, but equally capable of handling the challenging conditions they would face. Jensen took the wheel, his familiarity with the region making him the natural choice as driver. As they cleared the base perimeter and headed east toward Oakfield, Mitchell monitored communications on a specialized device that looked like a standard tablet, but could access both civilian and military networks. "Sir," he reported after several minutes, "I've been monitoring local emergency channels. Sheriff's Department in Oakfield is reporting multiple rescue operations underway, mostly in the western part of the county. Eastern section, including our target area, is currently without power or standard communications." Jack processed this information, his mind mapping contingencies. "Any mentions of the Wilson farm or our persons of interest?" "Nothing specific, sir, but there's chatter about a local official named Dawson coordinating private resources for recovery efforts." Jensen's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "That would be Richard Dawson, sir, building his image as the town's savior, no doubt." Jack's expression remained neutral, but a cold calculation was taking place behind his eyes. Richard Dawson was positioning himself as essential to the recovery, which meant any action against his son would have political implications for the entire community. Cooper Jack addressed the medic. "Based on the last report, what's your assessment of Emma Wilson's condition?" Staff Sergeant Cooper considered carefully. "If she found shelter and warmth shortly after the phone died, she should be stable. Moderate hypothermia is treatable with basic measures. The concerning factors would be any injuries sustained during her escape or exposure to contaminated floodwater." Jack nodded, then turned to Ramirez. "When we arrive, we maintain civilian cover. No weapons visible, no military terminology. We're old friends of the Wilson family returning to help after the storm." "And if we encounter resistance, sir?" Ramirez asked the question, covering a multitude of possible scenarios. "We handle it appropriately," Jack replied, his tone making it clear that appropriately would be determined by the specific threat posed. "Our primary objective is confirming Emma's safety. Secondary objective is ensuring accountability for those responsible." The team understood the implicit order. They would not be seeking extrajudicial revenge, but neither would they allow local politics or influence to obstruct justice. As they approached the Oakfield County line, Jensen slowed the vehicle, pointing ahead to where water covered the roadway. "First obstacle, sir, about 2 feet deep from the markers." Jack assessed the situation. "Proceed with caution. Mitchell marked this location on our map. If conditions worsen, we may need alternative routes for extraction." The Humvee forged through the water with minimal difficulty, its specialized systems designed for far worse conditions than a flooded country road. Beyond the water hazard, they encountered their first signs of human activity, a county maintenance truck with workers clearing a fallen tree. Jensen slowed as they passed, exchanging nods with the workers, who barely gave their vehicle a second glance, assuming it was part of the emergency response. As they drew closer to Oakfield proper, the devastation became more evident. The new housing development on the north side of town had been largely spared due to its elevated position, but the older sections near the creek showed signs of significant flooding. Main Street was visible in the distance, its buildings intact, but surrounded by standing water and debris. "Sir," Mitchell spoke up, "I've got a signal from the Wilson farm. Satellite phone activated approximately 20 minutes ago." Jack felt a surge of relief, though his expression remained composed. A working satellite phone meant someone at the farm was conscious and functional, hopefully Emma herself. "Make contact," he ordered. "Identify yourself by my name only. Verify Emma's condition and our ETA." Mitchell complied, his voice professional, as he established contact. The conversation was brief, and when he lowered the phone, his expression was grim. Sir, that was Robert Wilson. He confirms Emma is stable but reports a complication. Richard Dawson has apparently filed charges against Dylan Cooper for vehicle theft and reckless endangerment. Sheriff's deputies are on their way to the farm now to take the boy into custody. Jack's jaw tightened. Damage control. Dawson's getting the accusers out of the way before they can make official statements. There's more, sir, Mitchell continued. Robert Wilson says Dawson is personally leading a community aid convoy to their area this morning, bringing supplies generators and media coverage. How convenient, Jensen muttered. The hero arrives just in time for the cameras. Jack considered this development, his tactical mind analyzing angles and opportunities. Timing. Deputies expected within 30 minutes. Dawson's convoy within the hour. RETA. Jensen checked the GPS. 28 minutes, sir, assuming no further road hazards. Jack made his decision. We'll proceed directly to the Wilson farm. I want to be there when the deputies arrive. Jensen, you know the fastest road even if it's not the one on GPS. Yes, sir. There's a service road that cuts through the Miller property. Might shave off 5 minutes. Take it. Jack turned to address the team. When we arrive, I'll make initial contact. Cooper, you assess Emma's condition. Ramirez, Mitchell, secure the perimeter and monitor approaching vehicles. Jensen, you'll need to stay out of sight initially. Your connection to Dawson might complicate matters. Each man acknowledged his assignment with a nod. The vehicle accelerated slightly as Jensen turned onto a narrower road bypassing the town center entirely. Jack Reeves had participated in hostage rescues, counterterrorism operations, and high-value target extractions across the globe. But this mission, protecting a 16-year-old girl from small-town politics and power, carried a personal weight that none of those other operations had ever approached. 8 years ago, he had made a promise to Emma Wilson. Today, he would keep it regardless of the cost. Emma Wilson sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot tea, a blanket still draped over her shoulders despite the warmth of the farmhouse. The morning light streaming through the windows revealed the toll of her ordeal. Dark circles beneath her eyes. Rope burns on her wrists, now properly bandaged, a pallor to her skin that spoke of physical and emotional exhaustion. Across from her, Dylan and Megan sat in an uncomfortable silence, their own fatigue evident in slumped shoulders and hollow eyes. Sarah Wilson moved efficiently around the kitchen, preparing a substantial breakfast that no one had much appetite for, while Robert paced near the window, watching the driveway with increasing tension. They should be here soon, he said, checking his watch for the third time in as many minutes. Sheriff Potter said he'd send deputies to take statements. And to arrest me, Dylan added quietly, his voice resigned. My mom called again. Mr. Dawson is pressing charges for stealing Brad's truck. A truck you never touched, Emma pointed out, anger briefly overcoming her exhaustion. We'll tell them the truth. The truth, Megan said bitterly, doesn't seem to matter much against the Dawson version of events. Robert turned from the window, his expression somber. In my experience, the truth always matters. It just doesn't always win right away. The satellite phone on the counter chirped, drawing everyone's attention. Robert answered it, his posture straightening as he listened. How far out? He asked, then nodded at the response. We'll be ready. As he hung up, he turned to the room with renewed purpose. That was Jack's team. They'll be here in 15 minutes. He focused on Dylan and Megan. You two need to understand something. When Jack Reeves arrives, everything changes. He's not just some old army buddy. He's the kind of soldier that even other soldiers talk about in whispers. What does that mean? Dylan asked, confusion evident on his tired face. It means, Sarah interjected, wiping her hands on a dish towel, that you're about to meet someone who doesn't play by the same rules as Richard Dawson. And that's a good thing. Emma's fingers tightened around her mug. Jack won't hurt anyone, she said with certainty. He's coming to help, not to punish. Of course, Robert agreed, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. But his presence alone will change the dynamics in Oakfield. Richard Dawson may run this town, but men like Jack, they operate on a different level entirely. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching, not from the main road, but from the service path that cut across the back of the property. Robert moved quickly to the rear window, his expression shifting from concern to recognition. It's them, he confirmed, and they beat the sheriff's deputies. Good. The vehicle that pulled up behind the farmhouse bore no military markings, but its capabilities were evident in the ease with which it navigated the muddy debris-strewn path. 5 men emerged, moving with a coordinated precision that marked them immediately as something other than civilian disaster relief. The leader, a tall figure whose bearing commanded attention despite his nondescript clothing, surveyed the farmhouse with a practiced eye before approaching the back door. Robert was already moving to meet him. The kitchen door opened, and Lieutenant Colonel Jack Reeves stepped into the Wilson farmhouse for the first time in 8 years. His appearance had changed: more lines around his eyes, a few strands of gray at his temples, his build more solid than the recovering, wounded soldier who had once spent a summer here. But his presence, that indefinable quality that had always set him apart, remained unchanged. His gaze swept the room, assessing and cataloging in the way that had become second nature after decades of special operations. Then his eyes found Emma, and for a brief moment the hardened Delta Force commander gave way to the man who had once taught a young girl about courage and promises. "Emma," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of both authority and genuine concern. Emma rose from her chair, the blanket falling from her shoulders as she crossed the kitchen in quick steps. Without hesitation, she threw her arms around Jack's waist, burying her face against his chest in a gesture that bridged the 8-year gap as if it had never existed. Jack's arms closed around her, one hand gently cupping the back of her head in a protective gesture that seemed at odds with his otherwise military bearing. "I told you I'd come if you called," he said quietly. "I never doubted it," Emma replied, her voice muffled against his jacket. "Not for a second." For those watching, Robert and Sarah Dillon and Megan and the 4 operators who had followed Jack into the kitchen, the moment carried a power that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. This was not just a rescue, it was the fulfillment of a promise that had sustained both the giver and the receiver through years of separation. The moment was broken by the sound of vehicles on the main driveway, the sheriff's deputies arriving as predicted. Jack released Emma gently, his demeanor shifting back to operational mode in an instant. "Cooper," he addressed the medic who had followed him in, "check her condition. Mitchell, monitor the approaching vehicles. Ramirez, secure our transport. Jensen, stay out of sight until I call for you." The men moved to comply without question, each understanding his role in the unfolding scenario. Jack turned to Robert Wilson, extending his hand in a gesture that acknowledged their shared history and concern for Emma. "Robert," he said, his tone respectful, "we have about 2 minutes before those deputies reach your door. I need to know exactly what we're dealing with." Robert clasped Jack's hand firmly. "Richard Dawson's son tied Emma to a tree during the worst of the storm, left her to die. Now Dawson's trying to cover it up by having one of the witnesses arrested on false charges." Jack absorbed this information with a slight narrowing of his eyes, the only outward sign of the cold fury building within him. He turned to Dillon. "You're the one they're coming for." Dillon nodded, swallowing nervously under Jack's intense gaze. "Yes, sir. They're saying I stole Brad's truck, but I never touched it. I was trying to help Emma." Jack studied the boy for a moment, then nodded once, apparently satisfied with what he saw. "You did the right thing coming back for her. That counts for something." Before Dillon could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the front door. Robert moved to answer it, but Jack held up a hand to stop him. "Let me," he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. "Cooper, stay with Emma. The rest of you let me do the talking." As Jack moved through the farmhouse toward the front door, his posture and demeanor subtly shifted. To the casual observer, he might have appeared to be simply a concerned family friend. But those who knew what to look for would recognize the controlled readiness, the calculated assessment of terrain and angles, the precise positioning that gave him both visual coverage and tactical advantage. Jack Reeves opened the door to face the deputies of Oakfield County, his expression pleasant but unreadable. Behind him, unseen but present, stood the full weight of his training, experience, and authority, a force that Richard Dawson, for all his local power, had never encountered and could not possibly be prepared for. The confrontation that would reshape Oakfield was about to begin. The morning sun crept over the horizon as Jack Reeves opened the Wilson farmhouse door to face 2 Oakfield County sheriff's deputies. They stood on the porch, uniforms crisp despite the muddy conditions, hands resting casually near their holsters. "Morning, officers," Jack said, his voice neutral, but carrying an unmistakable authority. The older deputy straightened slightly, instinctively, responding to the command presence. "We're here for Dylan Cooper. Got a warrant for his arrest, vehicle theft, and reckless endangerment." Jack stepped fully onto the porch, closing the door behind him. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Jack Reeves, U.S. Army Special Operations. Before you proceed, I need to inform you that this situation involves multiple jurisdictions and potential federal interest." The younger deputy frowned. "Sir, with all due respect, we have a valid warrant signed by Judge Morris." "I understand," Jack replied, "and I'm not questioning your authority. I'm merely suggesting we coordinate our efforts." He withdrew a small leather case from his pocket, flipping it open to reveal military credentials that made both deputies blink in surprise. "The girl inside was the victim of a serious crime last night. My team is here as part of an ongoing investigation. I propose we contact Sheriff Potter directly before proceeding." 20 minutes later, Sheriff Potter's cruiser pulled up to the farmhouse, followed by an AgriCorp SUV carrying Richard Dawson. The scene on the porch had evolved. Jack's team had taken strategic positions around the property, while Robert Wilson stood shoulder to shoulder with Jack. Richard Dawson emerged from his vehicle, every inch the commanding figure in his tailored suit. His confident stride faltered only slightly when he recognized Jack, a brief flash of Desert Storm memories crossing his face. "Jack Reeves," Dawson said, extending his hand. "It's been years. What brings Delta Force to our little town?" Jack ignored the hand. "Emma Wilson brought me here. She called me after your son tied her to a tree and left her to die in that storm." Dawson's politician's smile never wavered. "That's a serious accusation. My son tells a different story about joyriding teens stealing his truck." "I have something better than stories," Jack replied, nodding to Mitchell, who stepped forward with a satellite phone. "A recorded emergency call from Emma made while she was still tied to that tree, plus documentation of her injuries, witness statements, and physical evidence from the scene." Sheriff Potter, a solid man with 30 years of law enforcement experience, listened to a portion of the recording, his weathered face hardening. "Mr. Dawson, I believe we need to reconsider the charges against the Cooper boy." "This is ridiculous," Dawson blustered. "One hysterical girl's call doesn't—" "There's more," Jack interrupted. "Sergeant Jensen." Jensen stepped forward, his Midwestern features familiar to Dawson, though it took a moment for recognition to dawn. "Eric Jensen," Dawson said slowly. "Your family had the farm on County Line Road." "That's right," Jensen replied. "The one you swindled from my mother after my father died. Offered her 30% below market value when she had nowhere else to turn." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "That's so, Richard? Business is business," Dawson defended. "Nothing illegal about negotiating." "Perhaps not," Jack agreed, "but attempted murder is very illegal, as is filing false police reports and obstruction of justice." Inside the house, Brad Dawson arrived with his mother, having been summoned by Sheriff Potter. The teenager's face drained of color when he saw the assembled group on the porch. "Brad, Sheriff Potter said, I need you to tell me exactly what happened last night. And before you answer, you should know we have Emma's recorded call for help, physical evidence from the oak tree, and statements from Dylan and Megan." Regina Dawson placed a protective hand on her son's shoulder. "My son doesn't have to say anything without a lawyer." "That's his right," Jack acknowledged. "But this can go one of two ways. A full federal investigation into what happened here, including your husband's business practices, or a local resolution focused on accountability and restitution." Brad looked from his father's stone face to Emma, who stood in the doorway, bruised but unbowed. "Dad," he said quietly, "I can't do this anymore." To everyone's surprise, it was Robert Wilson who broke the tense silence. "Why don't we all sit down inside Sarah's made coffee, and I think we need to talk like neighbors, not enemies." 6 months later, the changes in Oakfield were subtle but significant. Brad Dawson had left for a military academy, not the prestigious West Point his father had envisioned, but a structured environment where discipline was tempered with compassion. His guilty plea to reduce charges had resulted in probation, community service, and mandatory counseling. Richard Dawson had resigned from AgriCorp amid an internal investigation into his business practices. The revelation that he had systematically undervalued family farms while hiding his conflicts of interest had shattered his carefully constructed image. At Oakfield High, Principal Morris had established a zero-tolerance policy for bullying, with Dylan Cooper heading a student committee on school climate. Megan Foster had discovered a talent for journalism, documenting the changes in her community for the school paper. Emma Wilson stood beneath the oak tree, now bare in the December chill. The place that had once been a site of terror had reclaimed its status as her thinking spot, its enduring strength a reminder of her own resilience. "Penny, for your thoughts," said a familiar voice behind her. Emma turned to see Jack Reeves approaching across the frosted field. His civilian clothes couldn't disguise his military bearing, but the lines around his eyes had softened. "Just thinking about how much has changed," she replied, smiling. "How long are you staying this time?" "My leave runs through the new year," Jack said, coming to stand beside her. "After that, I've requested a training position at Right Pat, close enough to visit regularly." Emma nodded, understanding the significance of this choice. Delta operators didn't typically request training assignments unless they were considering their post-combat futures. "Mom's making your favorite apple pie for dinner," she said. "Dad finally got that tractor transmission fixed with the settlement money." The legal resolution had included financial restitution to the Wilson farm, along with several other families who had been undervalued in AgriCorp transactions. The community fund established as part of the settlement was helping to preserve family farms throughout the county. "Sheriff Potter called," Jack mentioned, as they walked back toward the farmhouse. "He's recommending you for that summer internship with the county emergency services." Emma smiled. "I think I'd be good at that. Staying calm in a crisis, helping people who need it." "The best kind of guardian," Jack agreed, glancing back at the oak tree standing sentinel over the Wilson farm. "The kind who's there when called, but hopes never to be needed." As they reached the porch, Sarah appeared in the doorway, waving them in from the cold. Inside, the warmth of the farmhouse wrapped around them like a promise kept not just by Jack, but by a community that had found its way back to what mattered. The storms, both literal and metaphorical, had passed. What remained was stronger for having weathered them.